Welcome to episode 5 of America, Yes or No. I want to begin first by just reviewing some of the concepts that we've discussed in previous episodes, because I want to make sure that what I think I'm conveying in these podcasts is actually what you're hearing. Remember that the purpose of these podcasts is to encourage us to think for ourselves by employing logic, reason, and historical context in the pursuit of truth. Now, while this is certainly a valid strategy for living our lives in general, the focus of these podcasts is the pursuit of truth with respect to politics and the true role of government in our lives. Two areas of study that have been largely overlooked by the majority of us, and that have also been dangerously obscured by greed, ignorance, and the pursuit of political power. As we review these concepts, here's a question to ponder with respect to the recent presidential election. Were the legal votes that were cast in this election, and we'll look at the issue of illegal voting in a later episode, were they based in logic, reason, and historical context as we've discussed? Or were they motivated more by fear, hatred, and ideological rigidity? So, we've talked about ideology versus principles. Ideologies being a defined set of opinions or beliefs associated with a specific group, and principles, in our usage, being basic truths or concepts that are universally applicable in our everyday lives, such as honesty and equality under the law. We've learned that ideologies typically present oversimplified and often distorted worldviews, that they require strict adherence to these views from their followers, while attempting to silence any dissenting views or thoughts. Conversely, adopting and living our lives by a set of time-tested principles helps us to make our own decisions. We can reason our way through confusing or conflicting ideologies and policies, weigh them against historical context, and decide for ourselves which are appropriate, sustainable, and most importantly, constitutional. We also discussed the phenomenon of the career politician and of the inherent conflict of interest this situation automatically creates by the politician always seeking re-election. We spoke of government awash in trillions of tax dollars, one which takes upon itself the decisions of whom to take money from and to whom to dole it out. A government bloated, bureaucratic, and entirely unaccountable to the very people whom it is intended to serve. A government that we ourselves have created after decades of inattentive and ignorant voting based on our lack of understanding of constitutional governmental limit. And we've talked about truth and how important it is to properly define truth and to seek after it impartially and determinedly. To understand that all truth, all real truth, can be circumscribed into one great whole. The more diligently we seek after truth, weigh it against logic, reason, and historical context, and seek to apply it in our own lives, the better prepared we become to resume our rightful place as citizens of this great nation, making informed and reasoned choices regarding our political representatives, and taking back our designated role as the true repositors of political power in our cities, our states, and our nation. I encourage you to listen again to these previous episodes and to refresh your minds on the details of our discussions. Now, having said all of that, I would like to proceed with our previously promised discussion of what I call essential truths. As I've said several times, unless and until we can come to a consensus that there exists some critical inviolate truths that must regulate and frame our political discussions and operations, then not only will we continue to be at the mercy of unscrupulous politicians and their philosophies, but we will continue descending as a people into chaos, anger, and class warfare. For some background, the development of this list of truths began about a year and a half ago when I was holding in my home a series of classes on the background and adoption of the U.S. Constitution. At one point, a participant asked me how we could apply what we were learning about the Constitution and America's founding to our current times. Well, it was at that point that I realized that there exists this huge gap between what we know about our nation's founding and system of governance and what we need to know about these things before engaging in political discussion and before exercising our responsibility in voting. I know next to nothing about nuclear physics, for example, so it wouldn't make sense for me to argue those concepts with anyone else, would it? Similarly, reason would dictate that we shouldn't offer our political opinions nor participate in the political process without having at least a basic understanding of how our government is designed to function, what role it should play in our lives, and most important of all, what role we, the people, should fulfill in this process. So, I then began compiling a list of ideas and facts that I thought were going to be necessary in helping us understand and make sense of America's founding and the relation of that founding to our day. I called that list Essential Truths because, as far as I'm concerned, they are true and unarguable. At the very least, I hope you'll agree that they have logic, reason, and historical context on their side, which should render them difficult to argue with. My difficulty was in deciding how and in what order to present these ideas, and I ended up grouping them into categories and finally determined to just present them one by one, and to expand on the ones perhaps needing further discussion. I'm also going to number them, not necessarily in any order of importance, but just to be able to refer back to them as needed. I place such great value in these truths because I am firmly convinced that their absence is the primary cause of our inability to engage in reasonable political discussion, and also for the cause of the god-awful mess that is our current government. This first group consists of truths regarding our nation's founding, and in later episodes I'll expand to broader, more current or topical truths. Now, I want to point out here that it's not the intent of this podcast to provide a comprehensive history of our nation's founding. There are several much better sources for that, which at some point I'll provide links to on the podcast page. For our purposes here, I'm just going to provide enough historical context to enable you to better understand and appreciate our nation's founding, and to help you see how its true history and purpose are being attacked and distorted for political gain. So here we go with essential truth number 1. The Declaration of Independence is one of the 2 founding documents of this nation. Written as a notice to the world outlining America's need to break away from British rule, it includes profound statements acknowledging the unalienable rights of mankind, namely life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It further claims as self-evident that mankind is naturally endowed with these rights by their Creator, meaning that he or she is born with these rights. These rights are not, as is generally assumed under other governmental charters, granted unto mankind by government decree. The concept of man's inherent unalienable rights alone makes our Declaration of Independence unique among the world's governmental charters. This idea is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of America being a free country, as we like to so casually say. The founders were well aware that oppressive and arbitrary rule by the King of England was keeping the American colonies from enjoying the full measure of their societal growth and prosperity. They also knew, from their extensive study of civilizations and religions, that only through the establishment and protection of the citizens' basic, God-given rights would a society be able to achieve its full potential, with each individual citizen living their life according to their own beliefs, desires, and motivations under a general framework of agreed-to laws and customs. At this point, the Declaration further states that, for this purpose, governments should be established to secure these inalienable rights, and that, to this end, said governments ought to derive their just or lawful powers from the consent of the governed. So, Although the founders saw individual liberty as paramount, they also recognized that to avoid chaos and anarchy, some level of governance was still needed. It could be accurately said that the founders saw government as a necessary evil. But, necessary or not, they knew full well that the power wielded by government was like an intoxicating drug, one that could seduce even the purest and most noble of leaders. The greater that power, the more seductive it became. And for that reason, they knew that they needed to craft a system of governance that could effectively protect the people's God-given rights, but at the same time limit that government's power and ability to enact and enforce its own laws. And that this government power had to have at its center the consent of the people. Truth number 2. The United States Constitution, our nation's second founding document, establishes the fundamental framework for our system of governance. Its structures and processes were specifically designed to set up a system that acknowledges and safeguards the rights of mankind, as specified in the first founding document, the Declaration of Independence. Now, we should acknowledge here that these two profound writings were not only groundbreaking and unique in all the world, but they are also inseparable. They go together hand in glove. The Declaration brilliantly acknowledges mankind's inherent rights and how it is the responsibility of just governments to secure those rights. The Constitution establishes the governmental framework for accomplishing those lofty and noble purposes as stated in the Declaration. My friends, if you really want to know how government is supposed to function, or what role government is intended to play in your life, please start by reading the Constitution. It's so simple that it can be found and read in pamphlet form. And even though written in a somewhat older version of English, both the Constitution and the Declaration are actually quite simple and entirely understandable. No lawyers or constitutional scholars needed. Both of them were written by and for a people that desired freedom, believed in the Almighty, and respected the rights of others. And although written over 200 years ago, the principles embodied therein are timeless, true, and for our own sakes, need to be revisited, understood, and implemented. I guarantee you that anyone who tells you that the Constitution is outdated or needs to be rewritten either hasn't read it themselves or sees it as an impediment to their goals of greater political power. Period. Read it. Truth number 3. The structure of the Constitution was deliberately designed to limit the powers of the federal government to only those necessary to ensure cohesion among the several states and their peoples. It was also intentionally designed, through its system of what are called checks and balances, to lessen the ability of any one group or political party to assume dominant control of the government. The founders of this nation had not only lived under the tyranny of a distant monarchical government, but they were well versed in languages, history, and in the workings of previous civilizations. Therefore, when it came to governance, they were able to clearly see what worked and what didn't. The one thing they all knew that didn't work was the concentrating of too much power in the hands of one person, or even in one branch of government. They knew that there had to be multiple branches of government, each independent of the other, and each with the power to check or balance the power of the other branches. In this way, even though the workings of government would be slower and more cumbersome, power would be sufficiently diffused to the point that no one branch, political party, or activist group could wield its influence to the detriment of individual liberty and equality under the law. Truth number 4. As a further safeguard to the rights of the individual, 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were soon added to the Constitution. Within the Bill of Rights, it is categorically stated that any powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states or to the people. Now, I imagine that most of us are familiar with at least the first 2 amendments of the Bill of Rights. But it is Amendment number 10 that, in my opinion, is probably the most overlooked and deliberately ignored provision in the Constitution. It says, in other words, that the federal government cannot assume under its authority any powers that are not specifically granted it under the Constitution. To simplify that even further, if the Constitution doesn't say the feds can do something, then that power is reserved to the states or to the people themselves. I ask you to take a moment and consider the almost innumerable powers that the federal government has assumed, or more precisely, that we have allowed them to assume, that not only interfere with our freedoms, but are also entirely illegal under the Constitution. Okay, we'll stop here for now, but we still have many more essential truths to discover and discuss. I hope that as we reviewed these truths, you've been able to consider them and their importance, and that you've also begun to see the stark contrast between them and our present realities. Until our next episode, I encourage you to do your own research into the founding of our great nation. It's a story that is both fascinating as well as inspirational. And yet, unfortunately, it's also one that has largely been kept from you, or distorted beyond recognition. A very good place to begin your research would be with reading our two founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. I'm confident that the more you read, the more you will come to understand why America is truly exceptional among the world's nations, and why its ideals and form of governance are worth upholding and defending. Keep seeking after truth. Do your research, ask questions, and weigh evidence. And, as always, think for yourself.